Greetings, class! Today our goal is to do our best with watercolors. We're revisiting our drawing that uses perspective, the illusion of space in an artwork, depth cue clues for the audience to give the impression of space, and we're going to learn some techniques for watercolor. So as you can see, I have my watercolor set here. I remember that my depth cue clues tell me dark items in the foreground. I got this book from the library, and it just reminds me of some of those basic depth cues we remember when drawing landscapes. There's a nice painting here by Paul Cezanne where you see some dark trees in the foreground and lighter items in the background. And I'm at my painting ready to get started. Now this watercolor set has a lot of color at the top and a lot of color in the middle, so it needs to be cleaned up. It needs a little bit of TLC, tender loving care, so that I can mix color at the top and so that my colors at the bottom aren't mixed. I have a variety of brushes. I have a Chinese brush here, I have smaller brushes for details, and of course a paper towel for cleaning my brush. So I'm going to clean up my watercolor set and get it ready to paint with. I'm using my imagination and my memory for inspiration from our own desert landscape here, and thinking about what colors I'm going to start with. I'm beginning with the wet on dry technique, which is a darker opacity, darker saturation, darker color. So I'm dipping my brush in, getting a little bit of green, and I'm going to get a different brush, use a little bit of yellow to mix in and make a lighter green. And I'm using the lid of my watercolor set as a palette to mix color in. My paintbrush is wet and my paper is dry. So this is called the wet on dry technique. This technique will yield a little bit of a darker color depending on how much water you use. The more water you add, the lighter your color will be, and the less water you add, the darker your color will be. This is the wet on dry technique. After this layer of paint dries, I can go over it with a second layer of paint to make it darker. Next, I'm ready for the wet and wet technique. I'm going to start with a wash and add color after that. So I'm getting my paintbrush wet and just adding water to the area that I'm going to add paint. Cleaning my brush, getting some purple, and I'm imagining purple mountains. Since this is a painting, I can use whatever colors I want to represent things I see in real life every day. As you can see, the paint is having an interesting effect with this wet and wet technique. And the paint pigment just drops right into that water and stays in the areas that you placed water in. I'm using my the tiny tip of my Chinese brush to get into those nooks and crannies. And I'm still gonna take an even smaller brush to get into those small areas. Just taking my time and trying to develop a steady hand. Now, I did the wet and wet technique. I'm back to the wet on dry technique, and you can see how the opacity in the color is a lot darker. Now, when you're watercolor painting, I've seen some people just kind of rush through and put a bunch of random colors in their landscape, add some black in there, some brown. Now, black tends to take over your whole painting, and it's not necessarily bad, but I've noticed that students are happier when they take their time and think carefully about what colors they want to use, change out their brushes for the right area, and use a few of these techniques. So please make sure you clean your watercolor set so it's nice and ready for the next person. Remember to clean your paintbrushes between each color so that the colors don't get mixed up. And I hope you enjoy watercoloring as much as I do.